November 7th, 1944, the people left by war in this small Massachusetts town went to the polls and voted in a national election, very much as people in the United States have voted since the election of George Washington in 1789. The old ballot box in the town courthouse had ticked off votes for Cleveland and Harrison and McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. And the memories of some of the older voters reached far enough back in time to recall how the power of a popular vote had shaped their way of life. A voter in Maryland had once been sold as a slave. A full-blooded Indian could remember the opening of the West. An old man in a Los Angeles park talked about the year 1864 when ballot boxes were brought up to the front lines in the Civil War. 1944 was the second time in our country's history that American voters were soldiers in the field. GIs cast an American ballot and took an American oath in rickety orderly room shacks all over the world. It made you wonder about Election Day back home. And November 7th, 1944 was a good day for remembering the streets of America. You couldn't miss the purpose of the day if you were there. Liquor dealers slept late. Everybody worked to get out the vote, and all of it built up to something like the excitement before a big game, where the outcome is in the dark, and the stakes are a way of life. Beyond that point where electioneering stops, there was some of the freest air to breathe that there has ever been. Standing in the sun on the safe streets of their towns, the American voters in 1944 knew that wars can begin in polling places. Wartime shortages and priorities had turned the clock back for transportation, and some of the means of travel on the roads that day had taken voters to the polls for the election of Woodrow Wilson. There's never been anything pretentious about the looks of the places where you cast your vote. Firehouses, laundries, buildings as different as the ways of life and the kinds of country we have, served as polling places for the people of the United States to make a decision that will be respected in the conference halls of London, Paris, Moscow, and eventually in the ruins of Berlin and Tokyo. The enemies of democracy have always claimed that a people as independent in their sympathies, as varied in their origins and religious beliefs as the people of America, can never choose a leader for themselves. Instead of these orderly lines, the enemies of democracy predicted riots and disorders at the polling places in 1944. Instead of a record-breaking registration, the enemies of democracy predicted apathy or disinterest or no election at all. Name, Helen Shaw. Occupation, secretary. Race, income, none of the rest of it matters. Name, Louis Stone. Occupation, actor. Occupation, housewife and mother. Occupation, farmer. Occupation, actress. Occupation, manicurist, elevator operator, florist, clerk, steam fitter. Occupation, shipyard worker. Name, Bob Hope, USO entertainer, and on November 7th, a free voter in the United States. Voters tracked alkali dust from Texas into the polling places, Georgia red clay, New England gravel, soot from Pittsburgh sidewalks, California's sand and New York dirt. A lot of votes were cast by people living in trailer camps and crowded rooming houses, brought to strange towns by the demand for war workers. But the ballot count kept rising, threatening to top the 1942 total of 28 million before noon. And late in the afternoon, at the end of their shift, shipyard workers headed directly from the yard gates to the polls. Gamblers were giving odds on Roosevelt, but no one else would make a prediction. When the lights began to go on in New York, forecasters still looked to the closest popular vote in recent history. In Times Square, barricades were knocked together to protect the store windows from the crowds that were already bunching up on street corners, waiting to get the returns from the traveling sign on the Times building, waiting to breathe in some of the excitement of the big night. At 6 o'clock, returns began to come in from the small towns in the north. It looked like the biggest registration on record, and before the day was over, 50 million ballots would be counted. Towns in Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Vermont showed a marked Dewey trend. As soon as the ballots had been tabulated, the score went out on the wire, and first-string radio announcers began to take over the microphones. In New York, Bob Trout began a broadcasting stint that would last until breakfast. Counted soldier votes ran about parallel to the civilian choice, showing that the opinions of the GIs and the people back home were the same. Dewey took an early lead in Connecticut and Missouri. Voters in Italy heard that Roosevelt was leading in Arizona. France heard that Dewey was ahead in Colorado, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas. California, Georgia, Connecticut, Delaware were going to the president. Arizona, Alabama, Idaho, Illinois followed. Most Americans stayed at home and close to the radio after supper. At 9:30, Vice President Wallace predicted a Roosevelt victory, leading the other forecasters by a good 3 hours. At 10 o'clock, Pittsburgh's Allegheny County turned in a lead for Roosevelt, upsetting Republican predictions in a vital state. And from then on in, the president began to gather the lead that brought him victory. It was a cold, clear night in New York. You could hear the shouting of the crowds for 15 blocks in either direction. Picked up by the airwaves, you could hear them above the noise of the rain in Hütgen Forest. And you could hear them on the China airstrips, where the B-29s were warming up for the blow at Tokyo. They were cheering the victory of their candidate, and they were living proof that government, even in a time of war, can be a question of conscience and not a matter of force.